So what the homework is, to reiterate, is 2 paintings done on paper. They can be in charcoal or they can be in ink, like I've shown you here. 18 by 24 or larger, that's however you elect to work. They must be both, one has to be an interior and one has to be a landscape. The interior should be deep space and include some kind of architecture. So what I'd like you to do is do a fully realized ink or charcoal drawing and then use a glazing technique that I've shown you or I will show you in order to implement the color. It's very important that the drawing be absolutely finished, then sprayed, then worked. Thank you. You'll notice that I've put out a little palette here. For this method, you don't actually need a lot of color. It uses very little oil paint. And generally the rule of thumb is if you're using the glazing technique, it's basically not glazing, it's scrubbing. So it's a little bit different than probably most of you were exposed to, which is why it's probably in your best interest to actually use good paint. So if you're using cadmiums, it's best to actually buy the real cadmiums rather than the hue. So what I've done here is I started out initially, and I couldn't find the printout for this one, but I started out initially, I project my images, I design them on Photoshop, looks like a collage, and I just delete. But that's sort of not really the point. You'll note that I paint from 2 separate images, one black and white, and that's not the same, I lost that one. But one black and white, high quality, glossy printout, almost as big as 8 by 10, and then the other one is printed out in color, and it's a good quality, glossy color as well. I print on glossy so that I can see finite detail, okay? Initially, I do the entire painting in actually a really cheap type of ink, which is just Speedball or the other kind. What's that other kind that you all use? Anyway, it's just a cheap black paint, and it easily dilutes. It's not like that really good paint that you use for calligraphy. This is just sort of the cheapy black Dick Blick version. So I do a whole version of that. I do it all unstretched, so I can move it around and easily move it from my kitchen table. I paint the whole thing in gradients that fit my printout image. And then what I do after it's dry, I simply wet it again with some clear water and a spray thing. I don't soak it. I wet the paper again, and then I staple it to a board. So I know that when I paint this ink, or when you draw charcoal, depending on how you attempt that image, you're going to want to sacrifice the edges a little bit. Okay, you will lose some edges. So if you do this in charcoal, you're going to have to spray the widths out of it. So I've got final fixative, but I only have 2 cans for you to use. And it is indeed final fixative. It's clear acrylic. Okay, so if you decide to work in charcoal, which many of you may prefer, spray it, spray 3 solid coats, then you can wet it, and then you can stretch it to a board. Okay, there's plenty of poopy boards. You can also tape it. Right? But I like to stretch it because I like to glue it to a panel when I'm done, and this is easier. You don't necessarily have to stretch it though. After it's stretched, I do a layer of brown. You can do a layer of thinned brown or burnt sienna or orange, I don't care, but start with a color that's transparent over the entire thing. So I use brown ink. You can elect not to use ink and just use oil paint. Just turp it down and spread it on and wait for it to dry, okay? You'll note that because I wet it and because I stapled it, it's perfectly flat. The next step is to use the gloss medium that I bought for the class. I have a special mixture at home of gloss medium as well as matte medium together. And so you'll note that if you look closely on the surface and you look at it in a certain light, you'll see these little shiny bits. That's because it's gloss mixed with matte. If you just use matte medium, it actually clouds what you've done. And I do 2 to 3 coats of that. And what I'll have for you next week is, as of Monday, I'll have cabinet rollers for you to roll it on, because you do not want to apply it with a brush. No, even the 2-inch gesso brushes, do not apply it with a brush. Because if you apply it with a brush and not a cabinet roller, you'll have marks, and when you start to scrub it in, you'll see those marks. Okay, you won't be able to get rid of them. So the cabinet roller will give you an absolutely pristine, perfect image to start with. Now what this clear medium does is it seals it with an acrylic surface. So I can now paint oil on top of paper. Everybody understand so far? Questions so far? Okay, using my good quality color printout, I have poured out a little bit of this Galkyd medium. Galkyd medium is just an alkyd. You all have access to it in the flammable container, but you'll also have access to this if you prefer it. This dries overnight, 24 hours, so you'll be able to work the painting fairly quickly. And what I like to do is I like to use stiff, cheap hog hair bristle brushes. Cheap. Because scrubbing something with a little bit of a grit is going to ruin your brushes eventually. After 5 paintings, you won't really have that brush anymore, so use the cheap ones. The first thing that I'll do is I'll take an area, and let's use the grape area here. I'll use the grape area here. What I'm gonna do is I'm actually gonna take that medium, put it over the surface, and you can be a little sloppy with this. It's not imperative that it be perfect. You don't have to use a lot. I should turn off the radio. So I'll do the grapes for you today. Apply, apply, apply. And you can work section by section, or you can work a whole large area. Now what I've got here is just basically a little bit of an alizarin crimson and a cadmium red. And what I can do is, while it's wet, work transparently. Bless you. And I can just work over my lights. It's not like watercolor. And mind you, anywhere I kind of go over, I can just simply wipe away while it's wet. It's no big deal. I can work fairly densely if I want to. I'll get a little bit darker as I near the edge, and a little bit thicker if I like. I've got another one over here. And what you'll note is you really don't have to indicate your value. You just have to simply indicate your color. And I work a lot with my fingers in order to get that transparent. Okay? I can go back and add the increments of color, and that actually has a little bit of yellow in it. So the thickest parts are really going to be the lightest parts, you'll note. Thickest parts are generally going to be the lightest parts. And I can blend wet and wet without having to worry about what's going on. And I actually prefer a sort of painterly mark, so I'll leave a lot of my mark as I move up. And then in finishing it, I like to finish it in 1 or 2 sessions, but see, I've got a couple of highlights here. I can sort of let those sit on top here, soften. And I use a lot with my fingers, but you can just do this with a dry brush if you like to. A little bit of a highlight here, and I can move on to my next subject. So I'll clean out my brush. When I move to a smaller, well, this I note that it's ever so slightly a light blue. So I'll take a little bit of white, and you can basically glaze with white, but I'll mix it ever so cool, a sort of lavender. And I'll pick up a little bit of what I mixed before. I'll add it on in one hit. And it's almost indeterminable. I mean, it's almost, indistinct as far as how cool this is, comparatively speaking, with the rest of it. But that little tiny little bit of cool that I've applied here next to the green will actually pop very quickly. So I'll actually add it to the whole thing and then work everything in wet. Sorry, I know this is boring. Used to love demos when I was a student, but I always think that you guys hate them. Gets a little bit greener, so I'll add a little bit green. Over here. And I won't really get into the detail yet until I've applied that local value. So I'm ready for a little bit of blue into my lavender right here. I'll just softly add that. And I work part to part. It's really the best way to do this. You'll note that the shadowy areas, such as this little bit of